Hello, my name's Dr. Alexandra Lloyd, and I'm the Fellow by Special Election in German at St Edmund Hall, Oxford. I'm delighted to be giving this talk as part of the 2021 Meeting Minds Global Event Series, and to share something of my work on Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Resistance Circle. Sophie Scholl was one of the core members of the White Rose, in German Die Weiße Rose. At its broadest, the resistance incorporated a wide network of individuals. At its heart were 6 people in Munich: students Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, Willi Graf, and Professor Kurt Huber. Between them, they secretly wrote, printed, and distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets, calling on Germans to resist Hitler and bring about an end to the Second World War. My interest in the White Rose is as a researcher in German studies, working on cultural memories of the Third Reich, and as a linguist and teacher of translation. In 2018, I founded the White Rose Project, a research and engagement initiative bringing the story of the White Rose to English-speaking audiences. The project does this through translation, publication, performance, and work with schools. We're also currently delighted to work with 2 external partner organizations, the White Rose Foundation, the Weiße Rose Stiftung in Munich, and the award-winning vocal ensemble Sansara. The undergraduate members of the project, drawn from across the university, have translated the White Rose Resistance pamphlets, 5,000 words of very challenging German, as well as excerpts from the White Rose members' letters and diaries. Where possible, it's these translations I'll use in my talk today. If you've heard of the White Rose, I'll wager it's because you've heard of Sophie Scholl. Indeed, in the English language reception of the group, much of the literature and imagery focuses on Sophie. In my talk today, I'll give a brief introduction to Sophie Scholl's life and legacy, drawing on the wealth of historical research on this remarkable figure. I hope you'll be inspired to explore her story further and to discover more about this fascinating and compelling individual. In a few weeks' time, on the 9th of May 2021, we'll be marking the 100th anniversary of Sophie Scholl's birth. This is a moment to take stock of the contribution she made to the resistance within Germany and the many meanings with which she has been invested in reception and commemoration from the 1940s right up to the present day. Sophie Scholl was born on the 9th of May 1921 to Robert Scholl and Magdalena Scholl née Müller. She was one of 6 siblings, one of whom died in infancy. As a teenager, she was active in the Hitler Youth. Indeed, when she and her brother Werner were confirmed in the Lutheran Church on Palm Sunday 1937, they were the only children wearing their Hitler Youth uniforms. However, Sophie came to see at first hand the suffering and persecution of those Nazism deemed unacceptable, how it treated its enemies, and she began to see through the propaganda that insisted on viewing fellow human beings as subhumans or life unworthy of life. Through a gradual process of discernment, she came to reject Nazism as she understood more about its ideology and saw how it marginalized and persecuted the innocent. A story is told about Sophie and one of her favorite writers, the German poet Heinrich Heine. An important leader of the League of German Girls visited the local group in Ulm, where the Scholls lived. At this meeting, Sophie reportedly suggested that they read and discuss poems by Heine. The leader, obviously appalled at the idea, declared that Heine was a Jewish writer whose works had been banned. Sophie Scholl is said to have retorted, "Anyone who doesn't know Heine doesn't know German literature." While still at school in 1936, Sophie had attended a dance where she met the young Air Force soldier Fritz Hartnagel. They developed a close, romantic friendship and intended to marry. They wrote often and saw each other when they could, increasingly infrequently as the war progressed. Their correspondence, much of which remains untranslated, speaks of their developing ideas and stance towards Nazism. For example, on the 9th of April 1940, while she was at home in Ulm, Sophie wrote to Fritz, "Sometimes I dread the war and I'm on the brink of losing all hope. I don't even want to think about it, but soon there won't be anything but politics, and as long as politics is this confused and evil, turning away from it would be cowardly. You're probably smiling now and thinking, she's such a girl. But I think I'd be far happier if I weren't constantly under all this pressure. I could spend time doing other things with a much clearer conscience. But everything else comes second now. It's just that we've been brought up to be political. Now you'll be laughing again. I just want to be with you again and see and feel nothing but the fabric of your suit. Is this a bad letter? It's not a breath of fresh air in your musty room. In fact, it's probably making it even mustier. Don't hold it against me. This letter was written on the day the German troops invaded Denmark. The following month, Sophie completed her school leaving certificate and began training as a kindergarten teacher. She then undertook compulsory labour service, Arbeitsdienst, in Krauchenwies, and then another 6 months of war service, Kriegshilfsdienst, in Blumberg. She found this period difficult, to say the least. She loved literature, music, art, philosophy, and religion, and found the authoritarian structures and rigidity unpalatable, and was frustrated by her fellow recruits. She commented rather disparagingly on some of the other girls who kept with them a copy of Goethe's Faust, in order, as she said, to give themselves airs. It should be said that during this period, Sophie herself was alternating between reading Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain and Augustine's Confessions, neither of which could be termed light reading. In May 1942, Sophie Scholl was finally able to begin studying biology and philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. She arrived in time to celebrate her 21st birthday with her brother Hans and his friends. At this point, the war was going well for Nazi Germany, with a string of military successes on both the Eastern and Western fronts. At the same time, Nazi designs for the elimination of those it deemed subhuman were also advancing at an accelerated pace. It was at this moment that all 6 of the core members of the White Rose Circle found themselves in Munich, and that the first phase of the resistance took place. Over the course of just 16 days, between the 27th of June and the 12th of July, 1942, Hans Scholl and Alexander Schmorell wrote, printed, and disseminated 4 resistance pamphlets. They used a Remington portable typewriter and a second-hand duplicating machine, and despite wartime shortages, obtained paper, envelopes, and postage stamps, and distributed copies by hand and by post. Each text began with the heading Pamphlets of the White Rose, Flugblätter der Weißen Rose, and a corresponding number, suggesting from the very beginning that the authors intended to produce a series of pamphlets. Each pamphlet concluded with a variation on the same message, instructions to the reader to make and distribute further copies. In July 1942, after the 4th pamphlet had been completed and distributed, Hans Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, and Willy Graf left Munich for a 3-month tour of duty at the Russian front. They were all conscripted medical students. Sophie Scholl was at the station to wave them all off. This short period in Russia proved to be a profound time for them in all sorts of ways. On the day of Hans's return from the front, Sophie wrote to Fritz Hartnagel, "Hans is coming back from Russia tonight. I suppose I should be pleased that he's back with us again, and I am. I'm already imagining the days we'll spend together in Munich in our little flat, days that could well be productive. But I can't truly be happy. The constant uncertainty that we live in nowadays prevents us from making nice plans for the next day and casts a shadow over all the days yet to come. It weighs me down night and day and doesn't give me a minute's rest. When will the time finally come when we won't have to focus all our strength and all our attention on things that are not worth lifting a finger for? Every word is scrutinized before it's even spoken, in case there is even a hint of ambiguity about it. Our trust in other people has to give way to mistrust and caution. Oh, how tiring and sometimes disheartening it is. But no, I won't let anything take away my courage. These trivial things will not get the better of me, when I know that there are other joys that surpass them. When I think of this, my strength returns, and I want to cry out a word of encouragement to everyone else who is oppressed." This letter is in many ways characteristic of Sophie's style and tone. She was deeply thoughtful and reflective, compassionate, and aware of the feelings and sufferings of others. She was also tenacious, lively, humorous, with a zest for life and an inner joy that sustained her. The White Roses pamphlet campaign resumed in the winter of 1942, and at this point, Professor Kurt Huber became actively involved. The fifth pamphlet appeared sometime in late January 1943, and the sixth in early February, following the news of the German army's disastrous defeat at Stalingrad. For Sophie, this was especially personal. Fritz Hartnagel had been deployed as part of the invasion of Russia in 1942, just as she was beginning her studies in Munich in the May. And in November, Hartnagel was among the 300,000 German troops surrounded by the Red Army in Stalingrad. He was airlifted out on the 22nd of January and sent to a military hospital in Lemberg, now Lviv, Ukraine, where he was treated for frostbite and had to have 2 fingers amputated. On Wednesday, the 17th of February, 1943, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and their friend Gisela Schertling spent the afternoon at the English Garden in Munich, where they had supper together. Before going to bed that evening, Sophie wrote a letter to her friend Lisa Rempis. "I'm just listening to the Trout Quintet on the gramophone. When I listen to the Andantino, I would rather like to be a trout myself. You can't help rejoicing and laughing, just as it's impossible to have a dispassionate or sad heart when you see the springtime clouds in the sky or branches in bud, swaying, stirred by a breath of wind. Oh, how I long for spring to come again. In Schubert's piece, you can really sense and smell the breezes and fragrances, and the birds and the whole of creation singing for joy. The recapitulation of the theme in the piano part, like clear, sparkling water. Oh, it is truly enchanting." On the morning of Thursday, the 18th of February 1943, the weather in Munich was mild and sunny. Sophie would normally attend a physics lecture at 8 a.m. Today, however, she did not turn up. At 10 a.m., she was also missing from Professor Kurt Huber's philosophy lecture, attended that morning by other members of the White Rose. Instead, at around 10:30 a.m., Sophie and her brother Hans left their flat on Franz-Josef-Straße and walked the short distance to the main university building. Between them, they carried a suitcase and a briefcase full of copies of the 5th and 6th White Rose Resistance pamphlets. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they entered the main university building. They deposited the pamphlets around the atrium, where in the adjacent teaching rooms, the 10 o'clock lectures were about to end. Their clandestine work completed, Hans and Sophie might have succeeded in their plan to disappear among the many students coming out of the lectures, but for a seemingly insignificant act. Sophie, in what she later described in her Gestapo interrogation as the result of either high spirits or foolishness, pushed one of the piles of pamphlets over the balustrade, and the sheets of paper cascaded down into the empty atrium below. This caught the attention of the university caretaker, Jakob Schmidt, who raced up the stairs and apprehended them. The Gestapo were called, the doors to the building locked, and the 2 students were arrested. Hans and Sophie were taken in handcuffs to the Wittelsbach Palace, just under a mile away. Originally a Bavarian royal residence, it had been commandeered and transformed by the Gestapo into the scene of incarceration, interrogation, and torture. Later that afternoon, as Sophie was about to be interrogated for the 2nd time that day, 300 miles away in Berlin, Propaganda Minister Josef Goebbels was addressing a crowd at the Sports Palace. In a speech lasting nearly 2 hours, Goebbels acknowledged the challenges faced on the Eastern Front, stressed the continued threat posed by international Jewry and Bolshevism, and put to his audience the necessity of committing wholeheartedly to total war. In her interrogation by Gestapo official Robert Moore, Sophie was asked whether she regarded what she, her brother, and their friends had done as a crime against the people and against the troops fighting in the East that deserved the strongest condemnation. Sophie replied, I quote, "I remain of the opinion that I did the best I could for my people. I therefore have no regrets about my conduct and accept the consequences that will arise from my conduct," end quote. The first White Rose trial began on the morning of Monday, the 22nd of February, 1943, in the Palace of Justice in Munich. Hans and Sophie had been interrogated throughout the weekend, and there had also been the arrest of another member of the White Rose, Christoph Probst, as well as Willy Graf and his sister Anneliese, who had also been involved in the resistance. When Sophie was taken to the Palace of Justice that Monday morning, she had left a copy of the court's indictment in her cell on which she had written one word: freedom. Sophie was tried alongside her brother Hans and Christoph Probst. The People's Court, the Volksgerichtshof, was presided over by Judge Roland Freisler, who had been dispatched from Berlin. Freisler had been an ardent supporter of Nazism from its early days. Known as Raving Roland, he was infamous for his vehemence and ruthlessness on the bench. A law student in Munich, Leo Zamberger, recalled attending the trial, which was, to all intents and purposes, a show trial. Freisler conducted it with the utmost severity, while the three defendants were calm, collected, clear, and brave in the face of his aggressive questioning. By 1 p.m. that same day, the trial was over. The sentence of the court declared that the accused had called for the sabotage of the war effort and armaments and for the overthrow of the National Socialist way of life of our people, had most vulgarly defamed the Führer, and so aided Germany's enemies and weakened national security. Sophie, along with her brother Hans and Christoph Probst, were taken to Stadelheim prison in the southern part of the city, where Hitler himself had served a sentence of 4 weeks back in 1922. The day before the trial, Sunday, the 21st of February, Sophie and Hans's parents had received a visit from another student involved in the White Rose, Traute Lafrenz. She informed them that their children had been arrested. Later that evening, an anonymous call from a student in Munich informed them that their children would be tried the following day. Robert and Magdalena Scholl travelled from Ulm to Munich and managed to enter the courtroom as the verdicts were being read out. Their son Werner Scholl had also managed to get into the courtroom. Robert and Magdalena Scholl were able to see their children briefly in the prison. In their sister Inga Scholl's account of their final hours, first published in the early 1950s, Sophie is described as having been resolute and calm. Her face, Inga wrote, bore a smile like that of a person looking into the sun. An hour before her execution, Sophie was visited by the prison's Protestant chaplain, the Reverend Dr. Karl Alt, who gave her communion and prayed with her. At 5 p.m. precisely, Sophie was executed by guillotine. She was 21 years old. The day after her execution, on the 23rd of February, there was a notice in a Munich newspaper reporting that 3 despicable criminals had been disposed of. That morning, Sophie and Hans's mother, Magdalena, wrote to Fritz Hartnagel to ask him to make an appeal for clemency for her children. His status as an officer would have carried weight with the authorities. What Magdalena Scholl could not have known, however, when she and her husband left the prison the previous day, was that her children were to be executed that same afternoon and were now, indeed, already dead. On the evening of Wednesday, the 24th of February, Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, and Christoph Probst were buried in the Munich cemetery at Perlacher Forst, directly opposite Stadelheim prison, where they had been executed. Magdalena Scholl wrote again to Fritz Hartnagel, I quote, "Yesterday, before sundown, we laid our 2 children to rest. We will not let ourselves be ashamed of Sophie. The chaplain said he had never seen such courage." End quote. The funeral was overseen by Gestapo agents hoping to identify other members of the group. In the months that followed, there were further arrests, further trials, further executions. In June 1943, Sophie's name was to be heard on a programme by the BBC German service that broadcast news, talks, music, and satire in German from London. In June 1943, the exiled German novelist Thomas Mann dedicated one of his regular broadcasts to the White Rose, declaring, "Good, marvellous young people, you shall not have died in vain, you shall not be forgotten." The war would roll on for another 2 years, but the White Rose, and Sophie Scholl in particular, would indeed not be forgotten. As I said at the beginning of this talk, Sophie Scholl has become the best known member of the White Rose, and as several scholars and critics have noted, she has assumed an iconic status. Strikingly, this happened on both sides of the Berlin Wall, in memorials, literature, film, and live performance. Today, if you travel about an hour and a half north of Munich, you will find the Valhalla Memorial, an imposing neoclassical building set high above the Danube River, filled with plaques, busts, and statues of noted Germans. Here, among the great and the good of German history, you will find a marble bust of Sophie Scholl, dedicated to all those who resisted fascism. There is even a waxwork of Sophie Scholl in the Berlin branch of Madame Tussauds, alongside, interestingly, a figure of Anne Frank. Multiple buildings, including schools, have been named after all 6 members of the core group, while the Scholl Sibling School is the most popular school name in Germany. One of Germany's leading literary awards, the Scholl Siblings Prize, is awarded annually by the State Association of Bavaria for a book that promotes civic freedom, moral, intellectual, and aesthetic courage, and fosters a responsible awareness of present-day issues. In 2003, a series broadcast on the German television channel ZDF had a competition to find the nation's favorite German, our best, the greatest Germans. In the final vote, Konrad Adenauer, first Chancellor of West Germany, achieved the top spot, followed by Martin Luther and Karl Marx, and then in 4th position by Hans Scholl and Sophie Scholl. Sophie was the only woman in the top 10. Of the various film versions of the White Rose story, the best known is Mark Watermund's 2005 film Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, which is a remarkable and moving realization of the story. The film received multiple awards and was nominated for an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. Like some other iterations of the White Rose history, though, the film places Sophie front and center, and in doing so makes it look as though she and Hans did the whole thing by themselves, pretty much. And that's a nice story, an effective narrative focus, but it's not what really happened. Now, in many ways, it is right to welcome this emphasis on Sophie's contribution, not least because it serves as a corrective to the marginalization of women in the history of the German resistance. Moreover, this was Nazi Germany, where a woman's role was conservatively defined and serial motherhood rewarded. Indeed, only a few days before Sophie's arrest, the regional governor of Bavaria had given a speech to mark the 470th anniversary of the founding of the university, in which he upbraided female students for studying and thereby shirking their duties. He declared that, I quote, "The natural place for a woman is not at the university, but with her family, at the side of her husband," end quote. He later offered to find husbands for any women who were not pretty enough to do so by themselves. A protest ensued amongst the students, but it did not gain traction. Sophie has over the years become an accessible figurehead for the movement, which in a way is hardly surprising. She is much less problematic than, say, the male student members of the White Rose, all of whom were conscripted medical students and were therefore part of the war machine that they were trying to undermine. Yet when Sophie becomes iconic, as we've seen happen in a not dissimilar way with other women in history, we might think of Joan of Arc, or in Sophie's own times, Anne Frank, we risk losing her unique voice and the reality of her lived experience. It is important to distinguish between the depiction of Sophie as passive icon on the one hand, and on the other hand, as a historical agent who joined together with others to work as a collective. An important aspect of the way the White Rose developed and carried out its resistance was the forging of connections between individuals. Sophie and the other students were influenced by older, more experienced individuals, by academics, writers, and dissidents. They read voraciously, they talked and debated and discussed. It is a great loss when this part of the story is not told. Sophie's image and example have also been put to the use of all sorts of agendas. Indeed, in January 2017, it was reported that the Nuremberg South region of the Alternative for Germany party, the Alternative für Deutschland, or the AfD, had used an image of Sophie to advertise on Facebook. She appeared alongside a quotation from the first White Rose pamphlet with the slogan, "Sophie Scholl would have voted for the AfD." In November 2020, during the COVID-19 crisis, a video from an anti-lockdown protest in Germany went viral after a protester compared herself directly to Sophie Scholl. The protester, who introduced herself in the video as Jana from Kassel, claimed, "I feel like Sophie Scholl because I've been active in the resistance for months, give speeches, go to protests, hand out pamphlets." During her speech, she was interrupted by one of the stewards at the event, who refused to do security for this nonsense anymore. The video then showed her throwing her microphone to the floor and storming off the stage. The video sparked outrage online, dozens of memes. You can have a certain amount of fun if you look up Jana aus Kassel or Jana from Kassel on social media. Even the tabloid newspaper Bild, not known for its subtlety, called the comparison in bad taste. The German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, accused the protester of unacceptable historical amnesia and of downplaying the Holocaust. Nothing, he tweeted, connects corona protests to members of the resistance. Nothing. Now, this incident was interesting in drawing attention to Sophie's iconic status, and certainly in Heiko Maas's response to her status as a kind of untouchable figure. However one views this, as a crass appropriation of another's suffering, or as a legitimate expression of an individual's feelings, this incident raised a much broader and more fundamental question about how we talk and write about oppositional figures, and how we do so in a way that is meaningful and productive. How do we discuss them in a way that is nuanced, which recognizes their faults and foibles, but which does not detract from the inspiration they offer? As a young woman who said no to Nazism, and as a historical figure, Sophie Scholl is an inspiring and hope-filled example of an individual speaking truth to power with compassion and fortitude, and one whose own voice demands to be heard. I'll draw to a close here by encouraging you to explore the various English language books available on Sophie Scholl, and also the published translation of selected letters and diary entries by her. These are listed on our website. I'd also like to recommend to you a recent live reading of the group's resistance pamphlets that we held online in February to mark the 78th anniversary of the first trial and executions. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.